January 17, 1781, his officer Banastre Tarleton rode toward a small cattle grazing field in upstate South Carolina with over 1,000 of the best trained soldiers in the British Army. Target was a ragged force of American troops, half of them untrained militia, who had a reputation for running at the first sight of a bayonet charge. Tarleton expected an easy victory, a quick slaughter, really. What he rode into instead was one of the most perfectly executed tactical traps in the history of warfare. Within an hour, his elite force would be shattered, and the man who designed the trap, backwoods general with no formal military education, would deliver a master class that officers still study at West Point today. So, how did a group of farmers and part-time soldiers manage to annihilate a professional British fighting force in under 60 minutes? South Carolina in late 1780 was a nightmare for the American cause. The British had captured Charleston that May, taking over 5,000 Continental soldiers prisoner in the worst American defeat of the entire war. British commander Lord Cornwallis controlled most of the southern colony, and loyal militias were terrorizing patriot families across the countryside. The American Revolution was, by most reasonable assessments, on the verge of total collapse in the South. General George Washington sent Nathaniel Greene to take command of the remnants of the Southern Continental Army. Greene arrived, he found barely an army at all, roughly 1,400 starving, poorly equipped regulars spread across the Carolina backcountry. Greene made a decision that most commanders would have called insane. He split his already tiny force in two. He sent about 600 troops west under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a man whose military resume read like a list of the war's most brutal engagements. Morgan was not your typical general. He had no wealthy family, no aristocratic connections, no formal training. He had grown up poor in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, working as a teamster hauling supplies through the wilderness. During the French and Indian War, he received 500 lashes from a British officer for punching a superior. Scars covered his entire back for the rest of his life. And Morgan reportedly joked that the British still owed him one lash because the drummer had miscounted. That kind of man does not forget, and he does not forgive. When the revolution started, Morgan showed up with a company of Virginia riflemen and fought in nearly every major engagement of the northern campaigns. From the siege of Quebec, he took a musket ball through the neck and kept fighting, to the forests of Saratoga, where his sharpshooters helped shatter Burgoyne's army. By 1780, Morgan carried a deep personal hatred of the British military and something far more valuable than any textbook education. He understood exactly how ordinary men behaved under fire. It is the detail that made everything possible. Morgan had fought alongside militia at Saratoga. He had watched Virginia riflemen shatter British advances from the tree line. He had also watched militia units panic and flee at Camden, where the British bayonet charge sent over 2,000 Americans running in minutes. Morgan knew something that most Continental officers refused to accept. Militia were not cowards, they were untrained civilians carrying muskets. Asking them to stand in an open field and trade volleys with British regulars was like asking a high school football team to hold the line against an NFL defense. It was not a question of courage, it was a question of capability. And that understanding, that honest assessment of what his men could and could not do, became the foundation of the trap. When Morgan learned that Tarleton was pursuing him with a fast-moving force of over 1,000 British regulars, dragoons, and loyalist infantry, he had a choice. He could run, try to link back up with Greene, and avoid the fight entirely. Instead, Morgan stopped at a place called the Cowpens, a well-known cattle pasture in the rolling grasslands of northern South Carolina. His officers were confused. His position seemed terrible. The broad river sat about 5 miles behind them, cutting off any route of retreat. Open ground stretched in every direction, offering no natural fortification, no dense forest to hide in, no swamp to slow a cavalry charge. Morgan chose this ground on purpose, and the reason was brilliant. Did not want his militia to have an escape route. He knew that if they could run, they would run. By putting a river at their backs, he removed the option entirely. Fight or drown. Cosmed, but Morgan was not asking them to do anything suicidal. He was asking them to do something very specific, very simple, and very temporary. And he spent the entire night before the battle walking from campfire to campfire, personally explaining the plan to every single unit. Crouched down with groups of shivering militiamen, told them jokes, shared stories about fighting the British at Saratoga, and calmly laid out exactly what he needed from each man. Told the militia they would not have to face a bayonet charge. He told them they would fire 2 shots and walk away with honor. He told the regulars they were the wall that nothing would get past. He even walked among the cavalry and told Washington's dragoons that they would be the ones to finish it. By dawn, every soldier on that field knew exactly what he was supposed to do, exactly when he was supposed to do it. That level of personal leadership the night before a battle was almost unheard of in the 18th century. Picture the battlefield at the Cowpens from above. It was roughly 1,000 yards of gently sloping open ground, rising toward 2 low hills. Morgan arranged his forces in 3 deliberate lines, each one set roughly 150 yards behind the last. First line was a thin screen of about 150 select riflemen from Georgia and the Carolinas. These were not militia in the traditional sense. These were frontier marksmen, men who could hit a target at 250 yards with a long rifle. Morgan placed them out front with one specific instruction: pick off the officers. When the British begin their advance, shoot the epaulets, target the men on horseback. Target anyone giving orders, then fall back to the second line. Second line was the main militia force, roughly 300 men from the Carolinas under Andrew Pickens. This is where Morgan's genius shone brightest. He did not ask these men to hold their ground. He did not ask them to stand and fight to the death. He asked them to do 2 things. Fire 2 aimed volleys at the British when they came within 50 yards, then turn around. Walk to the left, sidle behind the third line. Reform in the rear, that was it. 2 shots and leave. Morgan told them to their faces, "Just give me 2 good fires, boys, and then you can fall back." The third line was the backbone. About 450 Continental regulars and tough Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, positioned on the first low rise behind the militia line. The men trained to stand in a firing line and trade volleys. With British infantry, they were the anvil, and hidden behind the second hill, completely out of sight from any approaching force, sat the hammer. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, waited with roughly 80 Continental dragoons and 45 mounted militia cavalry. A killing blow that nobody would see coming until it was far too late. If you are learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. Cover military and strategy like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Now, picture this from Tarleton's perspective. He had been chasing Morgan for days across frozen South Carolina backcountry, pushing his men at a brutal pace. On the night of January 16th, Tarleton roused his troops at 2 o'clock in the morning and forced them to march through pitch darkness, across swollen creeks and muddy cattle trails for nearly 8 miles before dawn. His men had barely eaten. Many of them had not slept more than a few hours. Horses were stumbling. Infantry were dragging their feet through frozen mud. Tarleton was 26 years old, aggressive to the point of recklessness, and carried a reputation as the most feared British cavalry commander in the colonies. At the Battle of Waxhaw the year before, dragoons had cut down surrendering American soldiers, earning him the nickname Bloody Tarleton among the colonists. Caution did not interest him. Speed, shock, And the bayonet did. Every previous encounter with American militia had confirmed his belief that they would crumble under a hard, fast assault. Tarleton's scouts reported that Morgan's force was deployed on open ground, with a river behind them. Tarleton saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see: a trapped, outnumbered American force with nowhere to run. It was a gift. Tarleton ordered an immediate attack without waiting for his troops to rest, without conducting a proper reconnaissance, and without holding a meaningful reserve. Formed his infantry into a wide assault line and sent them forward across the frozen pasture at first light. The first thing the British encountered was the skirmish line of riflemen. Shots cracked across the field from long range, and British officers started falling from their horses. A captain dropped, then a sergeant. The riflemen fired, reloaded, fired again, then melted backward toward the second line, exactly as Morgan had planned. The British pressed forward. They could see the militia line ahead of them, a thin formation of rough-looking men in civilian clothes. It was the moment British regulars lived for. The charge against undisciplined colonials who would break and flee. The drums beat the advance. The redcoats leveled their bayonets and surged forward with a shout. 50 yards, Pickens gave the order. The militia line erupted. 300 muskets fired into the British ranks at close range. The volley was devastating. Entire sections of the British line crumpled. Men dropped in rows. The smoke from 300 simultaneous discharges rolled across the field in a thick grey curtain. Before the haze even cleared, militia reloaded with shaking hands and fired a second volley into the staggering British formation. Then, exactly as Morgan had told them to do, they turned and began moving to the left, heading around the back of the Continental line. Some of them jogged, some of them walked. A few of them looked back over their shoulders at the redcoats screaming behind them. But they moved together as a unit, following the route Morgan had walked them through the night before. They had done their job, 2 good fires, and now they were leaving the stage. And this is where Tarleton made the fatal mistake Morgan had been counting on. When the British saw the militia turning and moving away, they interpreted it as a rout. Americans were running. The line had broken. This was Camden all over again. Officers shouted for the pursuit. Surge of adrenaline tore through the British ranks, and their disciplined advance dissolved into a full-speed charge. Order collapsed. Officers lost control of their formations. Soldiers sprinted forward in a mob, heading uphill to finish off what they believed was a fleeing, demoralized enemy. They were screaming, "Bayonets forward!" Regimental cohesion gone, every instinct telling them this fight was already won. Crested the low rise and ran directly into John Eager Howard's Continental line. Fresh troops rested, standing shoulder to shoulder in a disciplined formation with muskets loaded and aimed. Howard waited. 40 yards, 30 yards. At nearly point-blank range, he gave the order to fire. The volley hit the disorganized British charge like a wall. Men fell by the dozen. Before the survivors could even process what had happened, Howard ordered a bayonet charge directly into the stunned and scattered British front. American regulars slammed into the redcoats at close quarters, and for the first time in the entire battle, the British began to stumble backward. At that exact moment, William Washington's cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill and smashed into the British right flank. 80 dragoons at full gallop, sabers swinging, driving straight into the exposed side of a formation that was already reeling from the frontal assault. The British line buckled, and then came the final piece. The militia. Pickens had marched his men around the back of the Continental line, exactly as planned. Now they reappeared on the opposite side of the field, reformed into a rough firing line, and advancing with loaded muskets. The British were being hit from the front by Howard's bayonet charge, from the right by Washington's cavalry, and now from the left by the returning militia. A full double envelopment a textbook encirclement executed by farmers, shopkeepers, backwoods riflemen against one of the most professional armies on earth. British soldiers who had been sprinting forward in triumph just minutes earlier now found themselves surrounded on three sides with nowhere to go. The British army broke. Not slowly, not in stages, it shattered. Soldiers threw down their muskets and put their hands up. Shifters, officers tried to rally pockets of resistance, but were cut down or surrounded within minutes. Some British regulars fought in desperate clusters, back to back, until they were overwhelmed. Others simply dropped to their knees. Tarleton himself attempted a cavalry countercharge with his small reserve of dragoons, but Washington's horsemen met him head-on in a swirling melee of sabers and pistol shots. Two officers actually clashed personally on horseback, Washington taking a wound in the exchange. Before Tarleton managed to break free and escape with a handful of mounted soldiers, fleeing the field at a dead gallop, the battle lasted roughly 1 hour. At that time, Morgan's force killed or wounded over 300 British soldiers and captured nearly 600 more, including entire artillery crews and their cannons. Tarleton lost over 80% of his command. American losses were 12 dead and 60 wounded. The numbers almost defy belief. The kill ratio is the kind of result that military historians double-check because it barely seems possible. Morgan did not just win a battle. He destroyed an entire British tactical force with a fraction of the casualties. Think about what Morgan actually did here. He took the greatest weakness of his army, the unreliability of militia under direct assault, and turned it into the centerpiece of a trap. He used their retreat as bait, made the British believe they were winning at the exact moment they were losing. Every line, every movement, every withdrawal was choreographed to pull the British deeper into a kill zone they did not even recognize until it closed around them. He did not fight the battle the British expected, designed a battle the British could not resist, and then let their own aggression destroy them. Cowpens broke the back of British strategy in the south. Cornwallis lost a quarter of his light troops and his most aggressive field commander in a single morning. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the material losses. British officers across the Southern Theater had built their entire approach around the assumption that American militia would always break under pressure. Morgan had just proven that assumption dead wrong, and the implications rippled through every British garrison from Savannah to Wilmington. Cornwallis was furious, burned his own supply wagons in a desperate attempt to lighten his army and chase Greene's force north into Virginia. That pursuit stretched his supply lines to the breaking point, exhausted his remaining troops, pulled him further and further from his bases of support. It was a chase born out of frustration, not strategy, and it ultimately led him to a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown, where a combined American and French force surrounded him that October. The British army that surrendered at Yorktown was in many ways the same army that had been unraveling since Cowpens. The ending of that campaign is well known. What makes Cowpens remarkable is not just that it worked. It is how cleanly it worked. Morgan understood his own army better than any general in the war. He did not wish his militia was something they were not. He did not try to make them stand and fight like regulars. He gave them a job they could actually do, told them exactly how to do it, built an entire battle plan around the certainty that they would leave the field after doing it. The retreat was not a failure of the plan. The retreat was the plan. Military academies around the world still teach the Battle of Cowpens as a case study in the double envelopment, in understanding your own forces, and in using an enemy's aggression against them. Hannibal did something similar at Cannae in 216 before Christ, luring the Roman legions into a pocket by allowing his center to bend inward while his flanks closed the trap. Military scholars have drawn the comparison for over 2 centuries. But Hannibal had veteran Carthaginian infantry and Numidian cavalry, warriors who had spent years training for that moment. Later, Morgan did it with militia, who had been farming corn 6 weeks earlier on a cattle field in the Carolina backcountry against an opponent who should have known better. Tarleton spent the rest of the war trying to explain what happened at the Cowpens. He blamed everyone but himself. His superiors blamed him for charging without reconnaissance. Cornwallis blamed the entire Southern campaign's collapse on the losses sustained that morning. The reality is that none of them were prepared for what Morgan built on that frozen field in South Carolina. Traps so elegant that the enemy did exactly what Morgan needed them to do at every single stage and never realized it until it was over. The ground at the Cowpens is quiet now. National Battlefield Park sits on the site with markers showing where each line stood and where Washington's cavalry launched their charge. The rolling pasture still looks much like it did in 1781. Green grass, gentle hills, open sky. It's easy to stand there and forget that for 1 hour on a freezing January morning, this patch of land hosted one of the most lopsided victories in American military history. If this kind of tactical breakdown is your thing, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We have a lot more battles to cover, and they only get wilder from here.